Hello everyone, and 2 of my review of the Index light novel. If you haven't seen part 1 of my review, the link will be in the description. Also, I noticed from the comments of that video that people want me to include specific examples for most of my points, and that's what I'll do more in this review. Although that means I'll be spoiling a few more details than I previously did. So for this review, if you haven't watched Index Seasons 1 to 2, or you haven't read up to Volume 12 of Old Testament, then this video probably isn't for you. Anyway, let's waste no more time and continue where I left off by talking about the rest of the characters, since we already covered Toma already. Obviously I won't be able to talk about every character in the series, as there are so many of them, so I will limit to the early main cast, but I'll also talk about some of the standout antagonists and side characters. Some people think Index becomes overbloated with characters, but I think this complaint is usually geared towards the God's Right Sea arc or New Testament, so I won't address that criticism fully. I'll probably do that in a later video, but I will touch upon it at some point. Okay, so the title character of the series is of course Index, and I have already made a video on her in which I did make admittedly a couple of unintentional mistakes, so I'll just quickly re-evaluate her character. Some people dislike her due to annoying personality, that she's just like a gag machine with her head biting towards Toma and a huge appetite. I personally think a lot of people who hate on her just see this as like a surface level character trait and don't even bother to think about what makes a character more interesting in depth. The point of Index is that she's treated like an object by the magic side, and while she tries to develop friendships with others, this always fails due to her memory wipe. Index's significance is with her relationship with other characters as they try to save her from the church. All Index wants is love, as due to her memory wipe, she has never experienced it, as she is abused against her will and hunted down by enemy magicians. That is why Toma saving her and the friendship she develops with Kazakiri is so important. Her relevance to the story is debated as her screen time becomes less and less over time, but I would argue that her character is pivotal to the entirety of Old Testament. Also, she indirectly caused the memory wipe of Toma, effectively making him the character we see for most of the series. I've also seen people on Twitter saying that she is useless in her base form, which isn't true. Her knowledge is unparalleled, which becomes a later plot point. All the churches value her knowledge immensely, which makes her pretty important. That and the fact she could become a magic god if she could freely access all her books inside her brain. She also manages to stalemate Ellis, who was taking out anti-skill squads with ease in Old Testament 6, and managed to defeat a lot of the Agnese nun forces in Old Testament 7, or at least injure them via her Sheol Fear spell. And this is just with her knowledge alone, not with any direct superpower if you get what I mean. While she is somewhat of a victim character of the series in the cases I've presented, these other ones can show that she can actually stand up and fight, even when she has the disadvantage of being unable to use magic. She also expresses annoyance that Toma does not tell her about his little adventures when he gets into trouble, hinting that she could definitely help him fight magicians. I understand why people do not like her. Maybe they feel like the depths of her character was not clearly expressed to the audience by Kamachi, but from my own interpretation and analysis, I appreciate Index for her character. Then there is Misaka Mikoto, our second main heroine, the third ranked level 5 and the strongest Electro Master Esper. I'm going to talk solely about her character in Index, so I'm going to straight up act like Railgun does not exist, as this is a review of Index and not Railgun. I know she has a lot of fans, but don't hate me for saying that I found her quite generic for most of the early volumes in Old Testament. Kamachi intended her to be the representative of the science side to explain all the sciencey things, and Index was the contrast being the magic side explainer, in a way. Her best moments as a character from the first 12 volumes are clearly in Old Testament 3, aka the Sisters arc, especially the moment where she's willing to sacrifice herself to bring an end to the project, and doesn't want Toma to risk his life fighting Accelerator. Although you could argue this seems better handled in Railgun, Her relationship with Toma is quite basic when compared to Index. While both of them like Toma for saving them, Toma's relationship with Index is more layered, as Toma is lying to Index about remembering her, which makes you question if that's the right thing to do. The reason Toma does this is because he knows Index is vulnerable. For example, he pretends to remember her to not hurt her feelings, therefore he is forced to pretend he is someone he is not for Index's sake. Of course, Toma also forgot Mikoto, but that doesn't affect their relationship nearly as much as Toma with Index, and partially because Toma did not save Mikoto before the memory lost. Mikoto fell for the new Toma, not the old one. Of course, these themes about Mikoto are explored during the Godright Sea arc, but we aren't going to talk about that right now. We will cover that when we get to that arc. I feel like in Index, Mikoto is defined by her relationship with Toma, as she barely interacts with any other characters. She has Kuroko in Old Testament 8, yes, but it's not nearly as fleshed out as it is in Railgun due to the lack of screen time for both characters. I like that in Old Testament 8 that Kuroko goes digging into the dark side to find out what happened to Mikoto, as Mikoto doesn't want to tell Kuroko about the sisters as she wants to hold the burden to herself. It says a lot about Mikoto as a character, but I feel it fleshes out Kuroko more than Mikoto herself, as Kuroko puts herself through so much hardship to stop Owaki from attaining the tree diagram remnant. Apart from this, Mikoto is pretty much dependent on Toma as a character in Index. She doesn't really do anything of note for most of Old Testament after the Sisters arc. I have to compare it to Index again, as she is the other main heroine. Index has her relationships with Stiyl, Izard, Kazakiri, Kanzaki, and these all contrast and complement Toma's relationship with her, as I'll explain shortly. I understand why Mikoto was granted a successful spin-off and Index was not. It's probably because Mikoto has a more popular personality and, of course, a cooler set of powers from the audience's perspective. I don't think Mikoto is necessarily bad in Index. She serves the story as a tsundere love interest, but I feel this is quite generic and her character lacks deep character moments after the Sisters arc in the first 12 volumes at least. And I know I'm probably going to get a lot of hate for saying this. Anyway, let's talk about Stiyl and Kanzaki. I honestly thought these two characters were kind of boring in the anime, as I didn't really understand who they were that well, and why the fuck they were just letting the church mess around with Index's head. They still had cool as hell powers, and that of course remains true in the novel. So both Stiyl and Kanzaki are members of the Anglican Church, and became Index's best and only friends. Although they are lied to, without them knowing that Index's memories must be erased in order to stop her brain from overloading with her perfect memory. They are forced into a horrible situation where they must destroy their relationship with Index in order to save her, and this tests Stiyl and Kanzaki as human beings. Kanzaki herself is a saint blessed with an incredible power, who became the priestess of the Immaculate Church with her saint privilege, meaning she is more fortunate than others in life. Although, as a child, she could not protect the Immaculate members who sacrificed herself to save her from the enemy magicians. She felt the burden of the misfortune around her, and accepted this fate. Therefore, she cut herself from the Immaculate Church, so they would not have to give up their lives to save her. This all ties into her magic name, Salvaire 000, the salvation of those who cannot be saved. And this links to her relationship with Index. She accepts the fate that Index cannot truly be saved, as she believes that this misfortune cannot change. Toma, however, changes her view to never give up on her friend, and to not accept the misfortune by finding some alternative way to help. Kanzaki and Stiyl gave up on being Index's friend, as it was painful to them to try and repeat it. Therefore, they simply acted like enemies towards her to erase her memories. Toma believes they should not have accepted their fate and duty, and simply recreate these memories to not give up on your friend. Stiyl and Kanzaki prioritise realism, fatalism, and their duty to the church above all else, even their relationship with Index. While Toma seemingly has no commitments or duty, he's an idealist who will never stop fighting no matter what odds are against him. And because of this, he shows that there is hope after all, that Stiyl and Kanzaki refuse to believe, but ultimately this tenacity causes Toma to lose his very self as a price by losing his memories. It is very symbolic as it shows the price of saving Index that Stiyl and Kanzaki were not ready to sacrifice in the first place. It is somewhat strange that Kanzaki and Stiyl both stayed loyal to the church even after they found out that Index was manipulated and they were both lied to. Or is it? If they betrayed the Anglican Church, they would have had to live their lives on the run or defect to an enemy church, similar to how Izard did in the Old Testament too. It would not have been practical as a solution. And later in the story we do see Stiyl have conflicts with Lola Stewart over her methods towards Index, which follows on from the very first arc. Therefore, I do not see Stiyl and Kanzaki not disobeying the church after this arc as much as a problem as it seems to be.
Now I would like to talk about the role of the antagonists in the early arcs of Index. I won't be able to cover every character for this, as there is a new antagonist introduced in every arc for the build-up volumes, excluding Old Testament 1, where there was no clear antagonist unless you count perhaps Stiyl and Kanzaki. The villains are usually multi-layered characters. They view themselves as ultimately good and want to change the world or do something for the greater good. Of course, not all the early villains are like this, but a majority of them are. I don't see this as a problem, as each villain is unique in terms of their goal, personality, and morals. Characters like Aureolus Izard want to save Index when they fail to do so, by giving her the immortality of a vampire, which should prevent the memories in her brain from overloading. What he doesn't know is that Index has already been saved by Toma, so his efforts are ultimately in vain. He is willing to kill others to achieve his goal, whether they are from the magic or science side, he doesn't really care. He is portrayed as a desperate man, and Kamachi stated that Toma would have become just like him if he failed to save Index in the previous volume. So Izard has more of a personal goal. He wants to save someone who he is once personally close to, even if they do not remember who he actually is. On the opposite side, you have someone like Musujime Owaki, who wants to create a fairer society in Academy City by devising a solution for the violation of human rights that happens in Academy City. Her goal is to shift the human experimentation in Academy City to animal experimentation, which is a far less personal goal than that of Aureolus. But again, she uses brutal violence to try and smuggle the tree diagram remnant out of Academy City. The villains in Index usually have the beliefs of the ends justifying the means. It makes them more compelling enemies than simply stereotypical bad guys with no depth to them and just act evil for the sake of being evil. Even these one-volume villains have a lot of depth to them, such as Sherry Cromwell, who lost the boy she loved and is willing to start a war to get revenge on the city-states that caused his death. It humanises them, and we as the audience can empathise with them as a result. Toma acts as the voice of reason, who destroys their illusion, bringing them back to reality instead of pursuing unrealistic goals that will only cause more harm. The character dynamics between Toma and his enemies is what defines Index. The antagonists usually reappear in the form of an ally, or act as a neutral side character. Accelerator is an interesting case as he starts off as a villain, but becomes one of the main protagonists of the whole series. We all know Accelerator then embarks on a redemption arc, where he becomes a better person. The other antagonists become good too, with some exceptions. You could call it a recurring theme of the series. Does this make the series predictable? I'd say yes and no. As I said, there are some exceptions. Some of the villains die or simply don't appear again, or have a more neutral role than straight away becoming a good guy. I wouldn't exactly describe Owaki as a morally good character for her first volume, for example, and Ariana Thompson, while helping Toma later down the line, is still simply a mercenary magician with no clear alignment of good and evil. Therefore, again, it is a simplification of the novel's antagonists to state that they all become good once they are defeated. A change of morals is often a good thing, as it paves the way for more character development. From defeat or failure, they have learned that their way of doing things was ultimately wrong and must pursue a different path in life. Despite Index's formulaic approach to villains, it doesn't feel too repetitive. as the personalities and goals of each villain makes them stand out as characters. Sure, combined with the somewhat formulaic and episodic nature of the plot for each volume, it might not seem very appealing to certain readers who dislike this type of storytelling, but honestly it's more of a personal preference rather than an actual inherent flaw in the storytelling. Sure, you may get bored of the same formula over time if there is little change. A good example would be the Endless 8 arc from Haruhi Suzumiya, repeating the same sequence of events with little change. Of course, it's not exactly the same as what I'm describing here with Index. The Endless 8 is a time loop, while Index is telling individual stories with a beginning, middle and end, while returning some elements from the earlier volumes to each story. My point is that Index keeps itself fresh by expanding its universe, characters and lore every single volume. This is the way we get to learn new things about the world, and the author gets to foreshadow more mysteries to keep the reader wanting more. So while the base of Index's early volumes are certainly in line with a more clear formula, there is enough distinction to keep us wanting more. Of course, the builder volumes eventually conclude, and Index's plot changes to a more traditional style story. I think this was the right time to do so, as I do think the readers might have lost interest eventually if it carried on the way it did, despite the interesting new elements that are presented in each of the build-up volumes. While 12 volumes is a lot of volumes to build up a story to the point where there is a more clear, continuous narrative, I think faithful readers are truly rewarded if you don't see it coming. You become much more invested in the world, and it comes off as a pleasant surprise to see the story shift as the world gets closer to a war between magic and science. I kind of went off topic here, but I wanted to address more of the plot which I touched upon in part 1. Anyway, on to the next topic. The world building. One of the greatest strengths of the Index world is its world building, as many fans agree upon. Kamachi even said himself that he finds it easier to write than writing romance. While Index is largely confined to Academy City as a location, it is a very engaging environment to have the story take place in. There are so many factions and layers to Academy City that it truly helps it feel like it could potentially exist. Okay, I know having a city full of supernatural people sounds kind of far-fetched, but what I mean is that Academy City is filled with a bit of realism to help it feel like it could exist. Such as Anti-Skill, who act as the police force of Academy City, but they are actually teachers who volunteer to protect the students. It makes a lot of sense considering it is a city with a vast majority of students as its population, so that the teachers would inevitably have to act as the police force. It's also quite a creative idea. Also, to compensate for the lack of adults, there is Judgment, who are the police force made of espers. It makes perfect sense to utilise these abilities to enforce law and order in the city. Due to the lack of adults, students who are talented seem like the ideal fit to protect the people of the city. And as the teachers have no esper powers, it makes sense that they would want to use other espers to deal with espers in case there was a situation that required a certain ability. I've repeated the words "it makes sense" plenty of times here. This is because you can add multiple elements to your world in storytelling, and sometimes these elements can feel out of place, or they are actually implausible for the world it's based in. But this isn't the case with Index. The world building ideas are not only good ideas, the ideas actually would make a lot of sense in the world of Academy City. Therefore, the world building of Index continues to be engaging to the audience. I mean, the world building in Index is so rich that I only scratched the surface by using this example, so I think it would warrant its own individual video in order to give it the due credit it deserves. So I'll leave it here for now. A perfect story does not exist. Whether you like it or not, your favourite story may have points in the plot which have problems in the writing itself. Or you may find yourself disagreeing with the creative direction the author took, saying that X should have happened instead of Y to tell a better story than the one we got. So for this section of the video, I'm going to go over some of the criticisms I've seen of the Index light novels, that I would like to address, and after that I'll raise some of my own criticisms. No character depth. Well, if you were listening to my section about the characters in Index, you should know that I think Index has amazing characters. And I do think its characters are one of the strongest things about the series. So I'm quite surprised that some people say that the characters have little depth. Even one volume villains like Izard have a lot of depth to them, as I explained before. And Izard isn't exactly regarded as one of the best characters in this series. I mean, people often see him as a joke or forgot he existed. Although that's kinda what the people who haven't read the novel think about him, which is somewhat understandable. But what I mean is, he's not exactly an important character in the context of the entire series, and yet he serves his purpose very well in that volume. Sure, considering his ability to turn his thoughts into reality was a little convoluted considering, but if we talk about the character himself, he was a flawed and stubborn man who became desperate and arrogant. He felt like a human being and not a cartoon villain. My point is that such a minor character as Izard of all people, has so much depth, and you can say so much about the character, because they are not one-dimensional villains. He has multiple layers to him. Like, what more do you want from the characters of Index? And that's just one example of one minor character. Imagine what can be said for the ones who appear more often. Not every character needs a character development arc on the level of Accelerator's arc. Each character has a different role and purpose in the story. Some characters don't need to have development in order to be well-written characters. Take characters from most of Tarantino's movies. Do any of the characters in Pulp Fiction have meaningful character development arcs on the same level as Accelerator? The answer is no. Because that's not what Tarantino is trying to convey. He wants to tell an entertaining but intelligent, unconventional story. While you could argue that the characters aren't the main focus of perhaps Pulp Fiction, and it's more how the story is presented, but isn't that the same case about Index? Index's world and themes play an important role too. And yet lots of people love the characters in Pulp Fiction. Why is this the case? They have engaging personalities, memorable lines, and serve their roles in the story for what they needed to do. Does this ring a bell? So when people say Index's characters are weak, I'm very surprised. I really don't think they understand what the author is trying to convey in the story. It's not as though the characters are hard to understand either. People have problems with how the side characters disappear or don't show up often, but this is simply due to the nature of the world and storytelling. Each character has a purpose in their arc. They disappear in order to expand the world by giving new characters a chance to shine. This allows the world to expand by introducing new factions. Index has an undoubtedly large cast, but as I said, each character has a role and they play it well. I don't see how it is necessarily a flaw. Sure, you might be displeased that your favourite character hasn't shown up in a while, but you got to remember their highlight volume where they did have a chance to shine. Usually the side character arcs are completed in a single arc too. Do you rather have them be turned into something like Himigami as an irrelevant background character? But in her own arc, Himigami was great as a mysterious and tragic heroine. That leads me on to another point about the characters, or more specifically, the victimization of characters. Well, it's a story about heroes. Superheroes, kinda, if you see Toma as someone who is super. If you look at old comic books, there needs to be someone to save in order for the hero to work, to act courageous and save the day. That's stereotypical trope. But you even kind of still see this in modern comic book movies, but less frequent now because there is a greater emphasis on strong female protagonists. I mean, Index does have strong females that are not reliant on any man. This is turning into something weird. Kanzaki is very independent. Well, apart from being tied down to the church. Oh no, but Toma showed her that her mindset is wrong. We can't have that in a modern setting. The woman should educate the man. Wait, we have Index, a girl? Woman-splaining to Tomer about magic? This series truly does have gender equality.
Jokes aside, saving a damsel in distress is a trope that has been done since the beginning of time, and will probably continue forever. Is it necessarily bad writing? I mean, a trope isn't inherently bad. The hero's journey is a trope, which we see in franchises like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. Yet it isn't necessarily bad. It depends how it's executed. Compared to an earlier comic book style of damsels in distress, the girls of Index each have a special quality or strong characteristic that makes them unique and more than capable to become badasses. I do think, however, that too many girls develop feelings for Tomer, and that really does get quite cliche. However, overall, I do think that Index does a good job in the regard of portraying female characters. Not perfect, but I think it's a good job considering the tropes that are there. Magic is difficult to understand. Now, this is a troublesome topic in terms of how to present how exactly magic works in Index. I do think that the magic in Index is well presented considering the problems that can often occur from having it in a story. When there is magic in a story, it runs the risk of characters being able to pull powers out their ass because, well, it's magic. Magic can do anything, right? Index makes a lot of effort to define magic to a set of laws with limitations and risks while using it. Stiyl Magnus can't exactly pull any power out of his ass. His magic has clear strengths, weaknesses, and rules. There are characters like Oriana who have more randomized magic, which is a bit iffy as the author can just decide she can do whatever magic now if he chose to write it in that way. The rules are less clear. Although she is limited to only being able to use one spell at once, having a limit to her shorthand grimoires, and not giving her spells that are too overpowered. There are more characters with randomized magic that have started to appear in the latest volumes of Index, but overall they are few in number and most magic users are similar to Stiyl in that they abide by clear rules and laws. I think the magic in Index is very complex, and in places it can be difficult to understand. I do like how it is presented in the story, however, and I do think that reading it again can help it become somewhat clearer. Is the magic info dumped onto the audience on how it works? I mean, discussions about magic are explained to the audience via speech, often from the magic side characters, explaining to Tomer how it is exactly relevant to the situation. I am a fan of show don't tell in storytelling, but the way that magic explanations are incorporated into the story, it feels organic and relevant to what is going on. What I mean by this is that imagine yourself in Tomer's shoes. You are about to fight an enemy magician, yet you don't know how magic works. Motoi then explains that we are doing XYZ to prepare for Oriana, for example. It's not explained for the sake of doing so, it becomes relevant to the plot of what is exactly happening in the story. The lazy way would have the narrator say what is going on, perhaps. Sure, Kamachi will expand upon the legends behind the magic, sometimes via narration, but he mixes it up to keep it fresh, rather than just have the characters doing an info dump speech every time. Honestly, I don't see this as an easy fix. I understand why some people would have a problem with it. I feel like by including this detail of the magic explanations, it adds a lot of weight and story to each spell that is used. It makes them unique, and it makes the power system more engaging in my eyes. It's more interesting than a random guy using fire just because he can. In Index, it's far more compelling and interesting. Not just because of the power system and how it relates to idol theory, but also the different applications of the ability. Therefore, how would you handle presentation of the magic in Index, while keeping it fresh, without info dumping, and while retaining the original complexity? The fan service. Okay, I kind of touched upon this in part 1, but yeah, I'm not exactly a huge fan of the fan service myself. And yeah, I mean, the reason why it's there is probably because of the current state of the light novel industry. I mean, Index is quite an old novel, it's been around since 2004. And I mean, ecchi series has always been around, so I mean, it started to become more popular in the early 2000s, I believe. But yeah, it's continued as a light novel staple. I mean, even Origairu, a series which doesn't have much fan service, you can still find fan service-esque illustrations in that novel. And it's kind of controversial considering the type of fan service that sometimes you find in Index. You probably know what I mean. And I'm really not going to go into it that much because it's probably going to start a war in the comment section, and I really don't want that. I'm not going to go into this issue. I mean, sorry if this disappoints you, but I'm just not going to give my take on this particular thing. Just know that I enjoy Index's story and characters, and that is what I want to see when I read the series. I thought about giving my take on this, but I thought again, and I think that if I said something, someone could take it out of context, and that could use to damage my reputation or something like that. So I'm just going to keep it like that. I don't want really anyone discussing it in the comments. So of course we can talk about the fan service, but I mean that particular aspect of it, it gets a bit cancer and toxic a bit. So sorry about this, but moving on. Apologies I didn't address this issue fully. Anyway, on to the next bit. Okay, I'll go on to this article from a few years ago about this guy explaining why the Index novel lacks any depth. It was quite funny at the time, and I saved it so we can all laugh at this dude's points. Classic French literature, for example, was written with the idea of declaring injustices and faults within a royalty or society, and was done so by seeking out means of disguising their works to escape censoring, while still remaining obvious as to what their work was calling out to and why. Those classical works can be analysed with such a question because of the simple assumption that the work is judging/criticising something that needs to be fixed by exploiting a public reaching position that the masses could not as individuals. The usage of fantasy in such periods was to merely point towards the idea that such change could, in fact, work out by exploiting another setting and world to illustrate an alternate reality that yet could still very well be attached to this one. Right, I'm no expert on French literature, but how many classical French works are actually in a actual fantasy setting? Okay, you're writing a fictional book like Les Miserables or The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Okay, The Hunchback is a bit fantasy. Is it? Not really. It doesn't have too many fantasy elements. I mean, it's just about a deformed guy in a church. Yeah, can someone give me an example of a classical French work that is actually fantasy, like Lord of the Rings or like Index type? Because I'm not sure that exists. I mean, it depends what you consider as a classic. If I think of classic French literature, I think of like Victor Hugo and Hunchback of Notre Dame or Les Miserables. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If you're French, Diddy, I know you're watching. Don't criticize me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm sorry, man. Anyway, moving on. I'll address this more fully once I finish the next paragraph. Index was never written in such a manner. It was written as the one-off idea of an author who likes throwing around tentative ideas at walls, and who was given the opportunity by his editing company to make much more out of it than he originally expected. There's no message to be read in Index. There's simply the fact that someone wanted to write a story about a boy with a power that could serve as the means to stop a secretly ongoing worldwide conflict, if used correctly, while sometimes using some thematics to drive specific arcs/volumes forward.
could and did, yet so many people try to confront each other with the idea that if they're reading Index, it's because there's truly something deep about this work that hardly any other does. Okay, it's pretty obvious Index isn't the deepest series in the world. I do think it has deep themes and characters, however. Star Wars is kind of similar in this regard. Star Wars on the surface has a pretty simple story, but the more you understand the themes, especially in the prequels, it has a lot of depth to it. It has strong themes of morality, betrayal, wars and politics, forgiveness, etc. These are certainly deep themes for any story. Index surprisingly has a lot of these same themes, especially when it comes to morality as a concept. What is the right and wrong method to achieve something? Is there such a thing as objective good or objective bad? What is the distinction between good and evil? These themes become much more clearer as the series continues. How this guy doesn't see the theme or doesn't consider them to have depth is very strange to me. He says that French literature is deep because of the socio-political commentary presented in the story that reflects the time it was published. Sure, it adds depth to these stories because of their historical significance. It portrays its own themes about politics in a real-world setting as opposed to a fancy one in Index. Take Hunchback of Notre Dame or Les Miserables. Both classic French stories that are grounded completely in reality that deal with themes of justice, religion, politics, forgiveness, and morality. If only those themes could be found elsewhere. Oh, they certainly sound familiar. Wait, those themes can also be found in Index? Ooh la la! Index is a modern masterpiece. I mean, his point about the environment that these classics were written in seems silly. Is Index not as deep simply because it wasn't written in an oppressive and unequal society such as 18th or 19th century France? I beg to differ. Sure, Index is not exactly a classic compared to traditional literature. It's not a competition who can write the deepest story of all time. Index is good for what it is. It's an entertaining read for teenagers that can also be enjoyed by adults, while presenting interesting concepts and themes. Index is a fantasy story, so it feels unfair to compare it to literature that takes place in a real-world setting. Of course, the themes in these classic books are more grounded in reality, therefore they feel more deeper than a fantasy story about magic and espers. That's not to say Index cannot be deep, however. Now, I haven't read Les Miserables, but I have seen the film and the play of Victor Hugo's novel. There are obviously many creative differences between the novel and the play, but a lot of the core themes are still there, I believe, especially when it comes to the characters. Take Javert, for example, the main antagonist of the story. He was born in a prison, and later becomes a prison officer. He became truly bitter of criminals and those who break the law, regardless of context. He sees himself as the embodiment of justice. Therefore, he justifies his cruel treatment of criminals because he believes it's right. Javert is shown mercy by Jean Valjean, which changes his worldview. His view of absolute justice is shattered by this act. This prompts him to believe there must be a God out there, and he sees no reason to continue on living. We see that Javert is a multi-layered character. He's not completely evil. He's just misguided by his beliefs. Sounds somewhat familiar? I mean, take Accelerator. He's misguided in his beliefs to commit acts of cruelty. His worldview is changed by the main character. He is shown mercy and forgiveness by Last Order, which changes him into a different person. Obviously, I'm not trying to say that the two characters are the same, but similar themes exist in both stories. How the characters are presented is also important for conveying these themes, well, that's a different topic entirely. Saying Index has no depth, however, discredits Kamachi's writing big time. Later in his blog, or his post, whatever it is, he also argues that Index has no clear message or theme. Does a story need to have a clear message or theme to be considered good? Some stories are not as simple to have one clear message or theme. Sometimes in stories the message can change entirely. Like how in Naruto is about working hard to become stronger until you become the Hokage, until you find out you're actually destined to become a god at some point. The theme of Index is morality, and as Kamachi said, Toma fighting people who carry complex problems. I don't know why this person didn't get this message, and overall it just seems silly to me. Now, onto my criticisms. My main gripes with these early volumes are some of the cliches, the fan service that feels kind of forced in, and certain plot holes. Angel Fall is by far the main perpetrator of this. Toma's dad happens to coincidentally cause a spell that affects the entire world by accident from positioning several souvenirs in a certain order in his house. Okay, that's kind of dumb. But it gets worse. The appearances of the people in the entire world are swapped with others, but weirdly the only ones who notice this are the ones who are unaffected by the spell. Well, that's a coincidence again. So in essence, if everyone was affected, it wouldn't cause much of a problem and no one would really notice. It feels really convoluted that the spell happens to cause this really random effect. So Toma is unaffected by the spell, and yet everyone around him swap into other people he knows, causing a lot of awkward interactions when his mum now appears as Lolly Index. What the fuck is this? Why does the spell cause people around him to appear as the people he actually knows in real life? The appearance swapping is supposed to be random. Why are the people aren't swapping to people he doesn't know? Because, you know, there's a lot of people on planet Earth. If Toma is unaffected by the spell, it makes kind of no sense how the spell would swap the appearances to people he already knows, and considering he got memory wiped 3 volumes earlier, he doesn't exactly know that many people either. I still enjoy aspects of the Angel Fall arc, but the Angel Fall spell itself is littered with issues from a writing perspective. I got to admit though, this arc is the only one with this many problems writing Rise, which is great considering how many arcs there are in Index. There are other issues which are more minor, such as in Volume 1, Styl's rune cards aren't waterproof. And let me ask you where Stiyl is from. He's from Britain, the same place I'm from. And what's very common in Britain? Fucking raining! It rains all the time here. So you're telling me that Stiyl, who hunts magicians regularly in Britain, hasn't waterproofed his cards. He just never thought, oh, I might need to do that in case it's a fucking rainy day in Britain. Are you shitting me? I mean, it's a minor issue, but... and he does later waterproof his cards, because it's how Toma basically defeats Stiyl, because he turns on the water sprinklers in his apartment in order to defeat him by removing the ink of his rune cards. I mean, that's kind of important for how Toma defeats Stiyl, so it's not that minor now that I think about it. I'm making it worse now that I think about it. Just forget about it. Anyway, there's another problem. There's another problem with the fireworks, which happen at the end of the I can't say the word, Daihasei arc, where Oriana is defeated, and in order to stop St. Peter's Cross from taking over Academy City, the fireworks happen coincidentally, and it's like, how did the fireworks happen just right in the time in which they were needed? I mean, you could assume that Alistair was watching with Underline and then ordered the fireworks to happen, but we're never given an explanation for this, so it's not that good writing wise. Overall, there are certain issues with the writing in Index, but I think they're few in number overall, and the series can still be enjoyed for what it is. Anyway, thank you for watching part 2. Next time I will tackle the God's Right Sea arc in Old Testament, which is the latter half of Old Testament, the first light novel series. If you're new, subscribe for more Toru content, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye bye.